Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to us by our good friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, if you're listening to this episode close to when it's released, you should be aware that the ASA conference is coming up very soon in Adelaide. I'm going to be there, as will many of the most prominent animal studies scholars from around Australia and indeed around the world. So, a couple of things to do. 1, follow ASA on Facebook. 2, think about attending the conference. And 3, become a member. ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, we're here in Sydney town. It is absolutely sweltering hot. We've got the air conditioning and the fan going and we're still very hot, but it's still very, very nice to be here with my special guest, Guy Scotton. Now, this is the point where I realise I don't actually know how to pronounce people's surnames. So
you
did I get that right?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Guy. So Guy is an animal studies scholar. In addition to studying and publishing in the field, Guy was also instrumental in the foundation of the journal Politics and Animals, which many listeners I'm sure will be aware of. You will have no doubt accessed some of the journal articles through that journal. Today we're going to be discussing Guy's book chapter titled Interspecies Atrocities and Politics of Memory, which appears in the soon-to-be available book Ethical and Political Approaches to Nonhuman Animal Issues Towards an Undivided Future. That book is co-edited by Andrew Woodhall and Gabriel. Now I'm going to brutalise this one as well. Garmendia de Trindade. Do you think that's how she says it?
I think so. I'm not sure I've ever heard him pronounce his surname in full.
It's him. Oh, so it's not. Oh, so it's Gabriel him.
It's
beg your pardon.
him.
Beg your pardon. Well, anyway, that's neither here nor there. The important thing is to say welcome to the podcast, Guy.
Thank you very much, Vaughn.
So, Guy, can you start by telling us what prompted or inspired you to write this book chapter?
So, the way I tend to think about the political turn in animal ethics, which is most of what I think about, academically speaking, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I did not study ethics or I didn't study philosophy or political theory for my undergraduate degree. I was actually doing writing and cultural studies and sort of swerved into this. So I'm drawn to normative political questions in animal ethics, but I tend to... So, the political turns provided a plethora of new concepts and frameworks and procedures for realizing interspecies justice, but I tend to immediately want to break them down into psychological and sociological details, basically about how human communities form the sorts of habits, dispositions, ways of attending to civic others that will shape and sustain commitments to justice. So any invocation of interspecies justice to me, I immediately want to break it down at that level. So what I'm doing in this chapter is using the concepts of evil and atrocity as sort of high temperature, high contrast ways to illuminate some of the commitments and some of the ways of forming commitments that I don't think the political turns paid as much attention to yet, namely the concerns of historical justice, symbolic justice, justice in cases where we cannot make good the harms that have been done to victims.
So, Guy, you've used the expression political turn a few times, and the book that your chapter appears in is a book that really is focusing and building on this idea of a political turn. For the benefit of listeners who mightn't be familiar with that expression, what does that mean to you, the political turn in animal ethics?
It means the trend over the past, coming up to a decade now of really intensifying, a drawing out of animal ethics into the idioms of political philosophy and political theory, specifically framing interspecies ethics in terms of justice and the institutions and categories that come with a theory of justice.
Wonderful. So, Guy, in your work, you use a framework of interspecies atrocities. Can you tell us what you mean by that, or what that is?
Sure. So the specific definition of atrocity I use is attached to a specific conception of evil used by the late social and moral philosopher Claudia Card. She wanted to reconstruct a secular account of evil that would capture the idea, which is pretty broadly available in most forms of discourse, whether scholarly but I would say probably especially popular discourse about ethics. The idea that there is what some people call a red line or a zone of irredeemable wrong that human activity crosses and deserves to be condemned as such, as somehow qualitatively distinct from other sorts of wrongs. No matter how harmful those wrongs may be in the aggregate, they don't amount to the sorts of things that we think of when we think of evil, and they don't, and importantly for me, they don't evoke the sense of moral horror that is, I think, particular to evil. And atrocities for Card were, she doesn't give a hard and fast definition of atrocities as such. For her, it's just the clear-cut cases of large-scale evils. Now, and I should say that for Card, her working definition of evil in the two books she wrote on the subject, she was actually partway through the third in a trilogy on evil when she died, unfortunately. I don't know, whether that material's going to be released, but I'd be very interested to see whether she says anything more about non-human animals in it. But at any rate, Card's working definition of evil is, to paraphrase, a reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harm that's committed culpably. And for her, intolerable breaks down to, it's really, she makes an appeal to a kind of, it's a normative concept of what would be an intolerable harm for someone, in the sense that it's not just, it's not that life is impossible having suffered the harm, but life is irrevocably damaged and limited by it. And she appeals then to flesh that out. She appeals to, or basically to a sort of capabilities account of, the sorts of basic conditions of flourishing that are required to live a life that's not scarred in this way by intolerable harm. So, and one thing that's very apparent is that this is a species neutral conception of intolerable harms. That is, that non-human animals possess the capacity to have their lives irreparably damaged in this way, and she does indeed commit to that implication. So it's a framework of atrocities that's readily available to animal ethics because Card explicitly, right at the beginning, in fact, of her first book on evil, says that this is a workable interspecies definition of atrocity. So that's the one I used to motivate the article.
So, atrocities is important to you and evil is important to you. Can you explain to us how evil manifests in our relationship or potentially manifests in our relationship to non-human animals? So, for example, is the institution of private property as it pertains to animals inherently evil?
So this is one of the attractive features of Card's theory of evil, that one of the things it's designed to get at is what she refers to as systemic evils or institutional evils, and these are properties of the social order that enable or in some way seriously fail to prevent the commission of evil, and especially the commission of atrocities. So
That's okay. Deep thinking. So we're thinking about evil, and we're thinking about what evil might mean as it relates to animals.
Right. So and so sorry. I just lost train of thought there. So I mean, this is something that I explicitly point towards in the chapter. That so Card gives an example which is it's pretty controversial, and I found it quite confronting to read, which is the idea that so one of the features for theory of evil is meant to really get at, which other theories of evil don't always successfully do, because they're more focused on the psychology of perpetrators and the conditions that in the perpetrator's mind that make something evil. They don't get it systemic evil, and they also tend to fall back on atrocities that are you can't say that an atrocity is trite, but there are certain categories that are quite rigid and ubiquitous in the literature, and Card does address them, but she tries to pick out different details of it. So, for instance, in the case of war atrocities, she specifically refers to sexual violence committed in war, and she also talks about what she calls private atrocities, which are massively distributed atrocities, evils committed against predominantly women in domestic violence. So it's that point, it's that last point, and where she then makes quite a startling claim that the institution of marriage as such is evil enabling, because it binds people together in the social and legal order in a way that makes it very difficult for people to escape the sort of abuse and manipulation that goes on in domestic violence. And so the analogy for me then would be, and I point to this, I think it's very likely the case that is true of the property status of non-human animals, that's so imbricated into the most egregious forms of mass evil that are committed against non-human animals, that I feel it can itself be considered an evil institution.
Right, so not just evil enabling, it can actually be considered an evil institution.
Well, I mean, it's if we're trying to be post-metaphysical about evil, I don't think it should detain us too much, whether we think it's inherently evil. I just think it suffices that it is so reliably connected to evil, right, that there's no way around talking about it as evil. So.
Interesting. So the concept of collective memory is also important to your argument. What do you mean by that, and how does it relate to the broader argument you're making in the chapter?
So, collective memory is one of those forms of moral attention that I think we ought to be thinking more about cultivating in terms of creating a culture of justice for non-human animals. And this refers again to a literature which is, it basically exclusively human-centric, like the literature on moral repair and on historical justice and so forth. And it pertains to the public civic aspects of remembering, commemorating, understanding, studying and recording the past, and the past with reference to a political identity, a social unit, the way in which all those forms of identity and affiliation have been connected to the good and the bad of the historical record of the community, the nation, at whatever scale you want to look at collective memory and the institutions that inscribe collective memory.
I should say that I read your chapter out loud to my parents, and you'll be pleased to know they didn't understand any of it at all. But I thought your use of the concept of reconciliation was really interesting. And you make a kind of suggestion that it doesn't matter that animals can't acknowledge or understand. The victim doesn't have to be present or aware of the gesture or the overture. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah. So, so I mean, one of the things I was sort of reacting against in writing this was, so there are really very few discussions of symbolic justice in the literature. Donaldson and Kimlicka do talk about it a little bit in Zoopolis, but there's a passage in Claire Palmer's book, Animal Ethics in Context, where she's talking about the possibility of restorative acts for coyotes who are displaced by development, which is just an example for her. And she sort of dismisses the idea of any sort of I believe the quote is any sort of apology or memorial will be wasted on them. And I don't think she's meaning to be flippant or anything, but it did kind of spark me into reacting to that, because so there's one sense in which she's obviously correct, which is that non-human animals don't understand norms of apology and reparation as such, and they may in fact never benefit from symbolic actions as such. But that's not really why we apologize in a lot of cases. We don't do it just to satisfy a victim. We do it to address ourselves to a community and to the norms it embodies, and to acknowledge that we've transgressed and to begin to weave ourselves back into that community. And I think that can be seen, you can do a marginal cases analogy to human instances in which many of them, most acts of, a lot of political apologies are done to victims who are certainly no longer alive. They may have relatives, they may not. It's considered coherent, generally speaking, I would think, to apologise for atrocities committed against cognitively disabled people, against children, and I think that's true of non-human animals. And I think it's also true, there's actually, it's funny, I forget which of the authors of one of the other philosophers who has a monograph on evil, he doesn't talk about non-human animals at all during the text, but there's a little footnote that caught my eye where he's talking about apologies, and he's only using this as a sort of edge case to say something more generally about apology. But he says, well, if I stumble and I kick my dog, I apologize to my dog. It's not just a reflex, or it's not an empty gesture to me. It seems to have something in it, and I think a lot of people would agree that there are, that we're responsible for and responsive to norms, regardless of whether the party, the other party that those norms includes, can respond to them in the same way.
Yeah, for me, because, I read it to my parents and we discussed it a bit as we were going through. And to me, the Rudd's apology, our former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology to Aboriginal communities who'd been taken, we call them stolen generations, that it made me think of that because, I'm not a member of the stolen generation, I'm not Aboriginal, but the apology meant something to me. To me, it said something about the kind of world we would like to live in and acknowledging the kind of world we have lived in. And even if there were no Aboriginal people, to hear the apology, I still think it would have been important. So I think, you play with that idea in a really interesting way. So, Guy, what would interspecies justice mean or look like to you?
So the paper itself is kind of ecumenical on what framework of interspecies justice we're talking about, because it's kind of, one of the points is that regardless of the particular institutions and procedures of justice that we want to endorse, there are emotions, narratives, rituals of justice that strengthen the social fabric around those institutions, and that those are worth thinking about in the case of non-human animals as well. I can just sort of, you can sort of plug your preferred theory of justice into it. I would just say that I think the great virtue of what Donaldson and Kimco have done to me is less the citizenship model that they propose itself, and more just really committing to the idea that interspecies flourishing doesn't just mean securing certain goods for non-human animals. It means developing in a kind of experimental, ebullient way, all sorts of ways of strengthening and reaffirming relationships with the non-human animals with whom we share the world. And I think that this line of thought, anything that's pertaining to civic virtues, to forms of, very grounded forms of moral attention, the sorts of things that we do every day towards one another as, members of a community and a culture of justice. I think that those things go hand in hand. The imagination of a lived community with non-human animals. So justice, to me, begins from within that, and it connects through to
Okay, Guy. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, so I was originally doing a PhD in something completely unrelated in political theory, and I had a seminar on posthumanism, and all the usual suspects came in, so Derrida, Haraway, and so forth. But I found myself, so I came into was sort of drawn into animal ethics in a sort of double negative, in that I was reading a lot of criticisms of animal rights theory, of any sort of liberal framework surrounding that, and I found myself objecting to the criticism and then wanting to, so in a sense, without having read the things that were being critiqued, I developed a kind of, I suppose, a sort of sympathy for them. And as a result of that, so maybe that's just the contrarian in me, but the first work that I then really engaged with in a positive sense was definitely Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's Zoopolis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Look, Peter Singer became a utilitarian after being trained in all the objections of utilitarianism. I think it's very, very funny when that happens. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, that's easy because it was only a couple of months after reading Zoopolis. And this is all really of a piece because it was a paper developing a model of interspecies civic friendship. So, talking about the sort of civic habits and dispositions that we should have towards particular non-human animal others, just as part of the community, trying to flesh that out. And I submitted that and ended up presenting that at the Mancept Workshops in Political Theory 2013. And I have to mention here that that's where I met my fiancée, who.
Well, you have to mention that. Yeah. Yes, what was she doing there?
So she's Catherine Wayne. She's another editor of Politics and Animals, and she works in animal ethics. So
was she just so taken by your argumentation that she couldn't help but ask you out?
It was the other way around. It was the other way around for sure.
Now, if you had to name one animal studies scholar, and it can't be your fiancée, who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It would have to be Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker, which I hope isn't cheating because they did co-author. And I would just reiterate that the reason for that is not the citizenship model that they espouse itself. It really did strike me that I could see the animals who I love. I could see it didn't have that austerity that a lot of the negative animal rights formulations, and especially obviously abolitionism, it didn't have that aspect to it. It let me keep my attachments and imagine them in a circumstance of just flourishing.
Nice. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think there's one of the next really big steps is integrating the normative with the psychological and the sociological, and this is beginning to be done. There's lots of really interesting work in social psychology on on forms of denial, avoidance, rationalization, and so forth. And I think that the way I would like to see that go forward is in a sort of experimental conjunction with animal activists, with their communication and outreach strategies. I want to see that sort of feedback develop into a research program that really lets us come to terms with our sort of moral self-understanding and its limits in moral psychology.
Fabulous. So, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think, without resorting to any of the obvious answers, I suppose, given that I've called the property status evil, I should probably just say the abolition of the property status. If I was going to say something other than that, it would be that. So I've got this thing I've been thinking of for a while is, just apropos moral psychology, is that it strikes me that a lot of the discussion about the sorts of rationalizations and evasions that people come up with to fortify their, the existing status of non-human animals. A lot of that is understood with reference to that they're basically protecting the self-interest, and the self-interest in this case is of a pretty obvious sort. It's what Dinesh Woodhall has a very nice phrase where he talks about the endless flow of pleasures that humans expect from animals, from animal bodies. But I think there's another side to this, and that's that it's absolutely terrifying to comprehend that you are responsible for something heinous. And I think people really, really want to protect themselves in that way. And that's a form of self-interest, but it's a form of self-interest that is very different. And I would like to see, this really comes to the relationship between animal activists and non or anti-animal activists, but I would like to see some kind of, I feel like there almost needs to be some sort of collective therapy where we are more cognizant of the fact that we're still in that position. As I'm vegan now. There's no certificate of moral authenticity that comes with that. It's just I could be horrifically wrong in multiple ways, and I think if you want to get through people's defenses in order to affect moral change, you have to be thinking you have to be engaging with people not just about that with the presumption that they're defending self-interest narrowly understood, but that they're defending their this terrible vulnerability that we have as moral agents, that we could be doing something really, really wrong.
That's a tricky one, Guy. Well, we're going to have to leave the resolution to that for a little bit later. So what are you working on next?
There's certain things that have spun out of this chapter, and I have a whole bunch of other papers, but the next thing I will be publishing is a chapter in Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Laurie Gruen's book, Animalities, which is a collection that is exploring the intersections between gender, madness, and non-human animals and non-human animal advocacy. And it was my feeling that most of the chapters were probably going to be talking about ascriptions of madness, ascriptions imposed upon animal advocates. And I thought I would invert it and interrogate some of the very unfortunate appeals to cognitive and psychological metaphors that people have used. The idea that speciesism is a form of moral schizophrenia, as Francione says, and is quite unrepentant about. Autism, people have talked about that human beings may be autistic with relation to non-human animals in the sense that they don't acknowledge them as minded beings. Narcissism, denial, repression, all of these things, which are basically what I call a diagnostic impulse within animal ethics and advocacy to try and characterize speciesism as pathological. And I think so beginning with the critiques that the theorists of disability have leveled against these particular things. It's not just that they're unfortunate, that they're sort of, that they play on derogatory and stereotypical understandings of mental illness and cognitive difference. It's that's just the wrong way to think about where people are at psychologically, in where they are located within what we can call speciesist institutions. And I think the research program for that sort of thing has to be laid out, and it has to be, it has to be approached, much more, in a much more sophisticated way, and in a way that doesn't assume that speciesism and the institutions that sustain it are sustained by basically human perversity, or human dysfunction, psychologically speaking.
Well, it sounds interesting. Hopefully we can have you back to hear more about that chapter when it's published. Meanwhile, where can people find out more about your work?
They can search for me on academia.edu. I tend to be the only Guy Scotton around. It's not a common surname. And I will give another plug to the journal, which I'm on the editorial collective, Politics and Animals. You can find that at politicsandανimals.org. And I would just mention that we are completely open access, so anyone can go. There's no login, there's no subscription, there's no fees. And our second issue we publish on a rolling basis, and our second issue is currently open for submissions. So please do check that out, whether you are a reader or a potential contributor, or both.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Guy. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. You can also like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals, and you can also subscribe to us at iTunes. iTunes is very, very powerful. They have a lot of control over which podcasts gets listened to and which do not. So if you subscribe via iTunes, and if you leave a review via iTunes, you help the podcast become more widely known and available to other people. So thank you in advance for doing that. And finally, I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.